Hi, Miranda.
Hi, Louise.
I'm so
How are
glad.
you?
I'm so glad we get to do this. So let me introduce you to everyone who's listening and who will be listening afterwards. My friend Miranda Kraus Chibber, and so you're author, and so the reason we are talking. Well, we've got a lot to talk about because I've known you since you've written your first book, which was about. I'm trying to summarize it nicely. It was about when people don't have the same faith and religious beliefs, and um, one of the partners find it hard, or both. Okay, so that's and the book's name was.
That book was Unequally Yoked.
Okay, good.
Right.
So thank you for that. And if you have a copy around, you can show us. Do you have one?
But I have a new book now.
Okay, we'll talk about that in a minute.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm sorry. I had to go and grab that one. This is the one that was published in 2018. I'm going to pull that back. I'm not familiar with working with cameras.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
And so that was published in 2018, and so then I did a few faith things after that, and faith-based things, and I decided to explore fiction after that. So that's what I've been doing for working in fiction now for the last year and a half.
Okay, and so the reason I'm talking to you today is because you honestly are sending the most interesting author emails that I've ever seen. Because you are really pulling us in, and I never knew that you were descended from the Russian Mennonites. I didn't even know there was something called Mennonites. So, if you will tell us a little bit about what exactly are Russian Mennonites, and then I'll tell everybody why we are talking about this.
Okay, well, the Mennonite faith as a whole is a religion, but there was, because of the way it developed, there was spin-offs, obviously, of the original faith that started in the 1600s. It started in the Netherlands, and so because of religious persecution, they spread out from there, and a lot of them went into Poland, settling near Gdansk area. And when persecution broke out there again, and Catherine the Great offered the Germans populations land in southern Ukraine, a lot of them went down there and settled. So the ones that we kind of identify ourselves both by our religious denomination and as well as the area in which we are descended from. So my ancestors came through the Russian Revolution, and that's why we call ourselves the Russian Mennonites. The ones that came in after World War II kind of even though they came from the same area, may have called themselves German Mennonites. Then you have spin-offs that came to North America far earlier than that, who were sort of became Amish or Hutterites, or my maternal grandmother came also from the area in Russia, but she came in the 1874 with the first wave of immigrants to North America, and those were called the Canadian Mennonites. So it just helps those of us when we are to collectively together to sort of identify, which ancestral group did you come to North America from? So that's a part of it. The faith base is it's a paternalistic religion, as many religions are, where the men are very. The men are. Let's put it this way: the men are correct, and the women listen to the men. So that's the type of culture that there is.
Yeah, you described something in your email, one of your emails. You've had really interesting ones about the use of a samovar, and all kinds of really interesting explanations behind your book about the customs. But the one that painted such a vivid picture for me was the long table with all the women standing behind the men and serving them. So I want you to to tell us a little bit about that part of a culture of what the women's role was and what the men's role was? Because, like you say, it's actually been part of our many. It's not just a Russian Mennonite thing. It's part of most of our inherited outlooks and beliefs, unless you, of course, were descended from Xena warrior women, So the rest of us, that's our reality. This is what we live with.
Yeah, and that was kind of hard because growing up in the 60s and 70s, when feminism first came on the scene and women's rights started becoming taking over, we were not really aware of how oppressed we were as females in our own modern day culture. So then add to that mix, there's the trauma that went on with grandparents going through the revolution, having their lives threatened, coming from a faith where the men were always, they had the final say with everything that went on. And we were taught never to question that. And what I described in the book is a situation where the men would eat first. When it came to mealtime, for example, the men would eat first, and then the women would eat, and then the children would eat. And that very clearly delineates the type of hierarchy that I experienced growing up. Now, my family was fairly modern in every respect. And but I grew up with a lot of my peers were from a much more strict culture where they literally, I would go to a friend's house and she would stand behind her husband and she would serve him and she would not sit down and eat until he was done. And I thought that was a bit extreme because I didn't grow up to that extreme. There was 3 brothers. I had to serve my brothers. I had to serve my father. But we ate at a table as a family 3 times a day, and we were together.
Miranda, to put it in context, this is not that long ago that we are talking about. We talk about our very recent history, 30, 40 years ago. Am I guessing wrong?
Yes. So we're talking the 60s and 70s. And in the 70s, actually, I had friends, as I just explained, they were newly married, early 20s, and they were serving their husbands, standing at their husband's elbow and serving him. And there were, these are women who, before they married, they had a taste of work life, but once they were married, they were not permitted to work anymore. My mother was not permitted to work, and was one of the heartbreaks of her life that she was trained as a nurse, and they got married, and she told me, she said, she says, I really wanted to work. She says, after I got married, I went for an interview and Dad came with me, and he sat there and he says, well, she can only work if she's home for meals, and she has to be home every night, and she has to be home on weekends. Well, sure. She says, my heart sank. She says, because I knew I could never work again. And she said, all I ever wanted to do was to be a nurse. And so she gave that up. And when I was a teenager, she was able to convince him that she could go back to work. But he gave her a very hard time about that. Now, I must say that my dad was a very loving man. He was a very loving father. But this was part of the tradition. We were kept in this suppressed state. And then, as
nobody saw it as suppressed. It was, we might have felt, your mother might have felt that there's some things you would, but it wasn't viewed as extreme. It was viewed as normal.
Yeah, but you must realize that when whatever you grow up in, that's normal to you. Okay? So my normality could be totally different from my neighbor's normality, or what's normal in my house, because what I grow up, that's what I see as normal. But when I decided that I really wanted an education, I remember telling my dad that I wanted an education. He said, you're a girl. What do you need an education for? And that's not that extreme, because I'll tell you, I have a brother who, he's got a very intelligent daughter, and my niece, and I had that same conversation with him, and he says, she's going to be a wife and a mother. What does she need to go to school for? So there's that paternalistic attitude, and to try to break out of that and to find my voice in all of that, to say, wait a minute, I am entitled to have an opinion. I am entitled to express myself, and to be constantly be put down and saying to say that my voice doesn't matter. It's taken me a lot of years to get to the point where finally I've decided that it's time for me to stand up.
Because we keep on repeating this. This is so deep in our belief system. So that's why I want to put it in perspective. This is not this long ago. We're talking 40, 50 years ago. And if we go with the 70s, then this is just very recently. So we are talking 2 generations to get used to women finally actually stepping into themselves. So my mother had to work because my parents were divorced, and it was so uncommon to be divorced that it was actually a shame. And I mean, she was kicked out of her church because she was a divorced woman, even although it wasn't her fault. So that is just one way in which my mother was discriminated against just being a woman, when my father was the alcoholic, and my mother really just couldn't carry on doing it. But she was discriminated against. And then we go into our own relationships, and then we carry it with us. Because I definitely took it with me for a long time. I've never been. I didn't grow up in a home where I ever saw a woman standing behind a chair. That was, honestly, Miranda, as you described it, that was like, wow, it must be really challenging to change how you view yourself as a woman, as an equal partner, as somebody who's self-empowered, the right to express herself, if that was actually the culture in which you grew up.
Yeah.
How long?
But you know, I in the 1970s, and I don't know what it was like in your part of the world, but it was the 1970s that this was even embedded into the paternalism was embedded into our laws. A woman couldn't, to call the police and say she'd been physically abused. The police would say, well, come on, the two of you need to settle down here a little bit, and then apologize to each other and go in and, deal with it. And then lots of times they wouldn't even bother with domestic violence phone calls. So a lot of women suffered terrible abuse in those years. And I think it was in 1973 that there was the first law that was passed when a woman challenged her husband for 50% of the farm assets that she had dedicated her life to. And because she had worked on the farm too. And in those days, it was, well, the business was the man's. So this was embedded in our culture, that women did not have rights. And as for myself, growing up in the 60s and 70s, I mean, let's put the religious stereotypes aside for a second and just look at our cultures. The 60s and 70s, we were coming into feminism was starting, birth control arrived in the 60s, and suddenly there was sexual freedom, and the men thought they were having a free-for-all. And the women didn't know how to act. So it was very destructive on relationships. That whole era was horrendously challenging to live through. And a lot of us got messed up. And, we took all those mixed up feelings and emotions into our marriages. And a lot of us had very dysfunctional relationships from that.
Yeah, Miranda, I was 20 when I got married. And it's this idea, and I know the thing that I had on me has been the same for a lot of women, that we can only have the career if we can still be the wife without inconveniencing the man. And honestly, I mean, I was a medical technologist, so I was on call, and I would sometimes work right through the night and not even have time to change back into work clothes and just carry on working, and then get home at night, and in between I'd run in and go and get something takeaway, and then carry on working until the end of the day and go home and make supper. And if a call out happens again, I would still do it in between, but there was not the slightest thought in my head that I could actually ask my husband to cook supper. It wasn't on my horizon when I was 20 or 30 or, much, much later. The only reason that he started helping is because I had burnout and I couldn't get out of bed. That was like literally the only time ever where he actually said, "Oh, I have to participate in this running this house because clearly nothing's going to happen here." And with the guilt that comes with, I can't get out of bed, I can't function, I don't know what to do, I don't know how to do this, and that terrible guilt that still, as a modern woman who believe I'm entitled to an equal relationship because I'm working hard and I've got intelligence and I've got so much that I'm bringing to the relationship, and I still had the guilt inside me.
Yeah. And I can completely relate to that. I mean, I grew up in, the kitchen belonged to the women, and we were the ones who did all the cooking. And I mean, there was a good part about that, because the women collected in the kitchen. We did the cooking. That's where the gossip happened. We had fun in the kitchen. But no, the men would come into the house and see a bunch of women. I mean, they would sit down and say, "Where's my pie and coffee?" But after that, they would go back to work in the fields or whatever they were doing. So it was very much that if you couldn't cook right, if you couldn't cook a decent meal, you were basically threatening your marriage. Then it was your fault. If the marriage was failing, you weren't cooking well enough, or you weren't cleaning well enough, or you weren't serving your husband well enough.
And now we're changing it to two people who have the same hours, and the woman still feels she has to take care of the children, she has to take care of the shopping, she has to keep the house clean and cook and do this amazing job at work. And then something has to give. We just can't do that. And so we are changing that, but just to get rid of the guilt. I want to show you a book cover just now, but Miranda, it took me until last year to be sick, to have a slip disc, so that I couldn't actually move. I passed out if I tried to get just to the toilet and back. So I literally passed out if I took 2 steps. So I just couldn't take care of myself, and it was COVID times. There was nobody else around to help. And this is the first time ever where my husband actually served on me hand and foot, and I still felt so ridiculously guilty. And taking into consideration that in 2 years he's had 3 operations, he has been served, waited on, bathed, everything done for him while he was recuperating from 3 big major operations. So because he was in an accident, so. And after all of that, I still feel guilty for lying on my back, and he has to take care of me. That guilt. And that was the first time in my life when I actually addressed it, and I decided, no, Louise, you have to enjoy this for once in your life, that there's somebody who's taking care of you. You have to change your mind about it. You have to let somebody else help you, because if you don't enjoy it and you feel guilty about it, you're going to take it out of somebody else's hands.
And that is something that we need to learn as women too, is to allow ourselves to be taken care of at certain points, without becoming dependent, though, on the man, and that's the tricky part. When I went through my vision crisis with my eyesight, where I almost lost my eyesight, and there was like about 3 to 6 months, somewhere in there, where there was the deterioration was so dramatic on a daily basis, and I got to a point where I literally I couldn't do anything. I couldn't watch television. I couldn't read. I couldn't be on my computer. And it was all I could do is if he would drive me to the grocery store, maybe I could do some grocery shopping. But even then, I felt completely helpless for months. And that's probably the most difficult time that I'd ever had, and where I really, really wanted to give up hope and wanted to quit.
You still wanted to do groceries.
Yes, because I felt I felt that only I knew how.
That's another one. That's another one which we are guilty of. We feel we are the only ones who know how, and nobody else can do it as well as us. I mean, we don't let other people do it, but it's not the same issue, but we do it.
No, yeah.
Okay, Miranda, let's go and look at a few comments here and see what's here. Hi, Antoinette. So how does it feel to be on the other side tonight, hey? Yes, about education. Yeah. And there you go.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Yeah. So, why do I have a private chat here? Oh, it's you. Okay. It's you having a private chat here. Okay. Before we open. Okay. So, all right. So what I want to do is let me quickly go and find your book cover, because I've got it here somewhere.
So I'm going to hold it up here. This is
okay. You can hold it.
Ah. Okay.
It's lovely.
And
I've got it here.
There you go. Okay. So, and there we're talking about, as you can tell by the title of that, is you had it up there.
Yeah.
First came the horses, and then came the fires. Then they came for us. So the story is very much about a survival story during the Russian Revolution, and about a Mennonite family. It's a Mennonite girl that's the main character, and her sister, a secondary character, and then we meet the family. And this first book is all about meeting the Mennonite family and the culture. Man, I have problems with camera. I'm just a little bit dyslexic here. Meeting the Mennonite family and their lifestyle, and sort of trying to give a picture of what normal was to them. And this is where we really get to see and understand the paternal culture before the revolution really hits. So the angst is here about the revolution, and it's in the background because World War I was on at that time, and in Russia was obviously Russia and Germany were at war. It was a very difficult time. So when I try to use a little bit of humor in my blog, in my newsletters, and saying, well, these are German-speaking Dutch Mennonites who lived in Russia, so it's a very complicated way of describing that, and that identity, self-identification alone led to a certain amount of confusion for myself growing up. Is like, well, what am I? Am I Dutch? Am I German? Am I Russian? What am I? Am I Ukrainian?
You know, South Africans are like that. We are such a mixed breed of Dutch and German and French, and a few British settlers thrown in there. So we are a very mixed up breed.
So you can relate.
Yeah, there's a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of that. And
yeah,
but of course it's, you know what, if as long as we get everybody's strengths, then it's great.
Yeah.
Okay, so your story, are you, I love stories that's got a historical foundation. And I also think it's quite topical for us living, you know, where we've just gone through riots and stuff like that, you know, where you start living with that fear, and you still have to deal with your interpersonal stuff, and you have to deal with your relationship stuff, and you have to deal with being locked down, and with financial insecurities. So there's a whole lot going on. So I'm looking forward to reading it, because are you taking your main character on a journey of growing through this?
Yes, she will be growing. Also, the trauma, she'll be going through a lot of trauma. She goes through one trauma in the book where she's confronted by a horse who races through the barn, and he knocks her down, and she's injured, but she has nightmares because it's done during a raid on the family farm. And it's seemingly an innocuous situation, but it haunts her. And that follows her through the book, and she realizes that at that point that there's a war going on, and the Mennonites are in harm's way, and so that's where we start seeing more and more development about what's going on in Russia, what's going on with the revolution, and how Lenin was provoking the revolution to try to overturn the imperial government. And so this all comes in there, and trauma is obviously going to be a huge part of her growing. Part of it's a struggle. It's a human struggle that she'll be going through, both her and her sister Anna, and they will. Every book will take you to another level within the war, and she's going to be going through everything that women go through in trauma, especially in wartime.
Okay, so I want to ask you, I want to just step away from that for a minute, and I just want to come back to our lives, because the one thing that we haven't talked about is how does this generational outlooks impact on our relationships with our parents? Was your relationships with your parents in any way compromised by growing up in the society?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of stuff here, because I think any child of war or who's been through trauma, that is going to impact on when they grow up. It's going to impact on how they parent, because they've been wounded, and so you've got fear, you've got shame, you've got guilt, just survivor guilt. I think the Mennonites grew a lot. There was a lot of survivor guilt that went on, and they weren't innocent totally. And I think that's the one, because their faith teaches so much strongly about forgiveness and acceptance, and the Mennonite way is the way of peace. We are to have peace at all costs. And so they ran for their life rather than defend themselves. And so that certainly impacted on my life, because not only as a woman, I'm not allowed to stand up and have my voice, but now I'm in a religion that says peace at all costs. And so therefore accept the responsibility of everything that happens. Accept the responsibility. It's somehow it's your fault. And so there's a lot of this blaming and guilt that goes on. But then on top of it, the trauma that they went through, a lot of people had certainly the stuff that happens with trauma. There's addictions, there's anxiety issues, depression, all these mental health issues were very, very prominent in the survivors that came out. My dad had a much greater time with some things, because his biological mother died when he was 5 months old, and he was adopted by her sister and raised by her sister. But then his biological dad, and he had 5 siblings, they moved out to the other side of the country. And so he grew up without his biological family. His biological father married someone else. They had very little to do with him. And because transportation it just wasn't that easy to drive, 3,000 miles back in the 50s or 40s. He grew up feeling unwanted, unknown and unwanted. And so that orphan mindset haunted him, and that affected me. Okay. And my mother's father came out of the revolution as well, but her mother was Canadian. And so there was, but they went through the Depression. And so there was this trauma of not having enough to eat and making sure that you store up food. And that became an obsession with her throughout her life, to the point where when, after my dad died, I mean, they had 5 freezers, 5 deep chest freezers in the house full of food, of old food that had to be thrown out. She was a food hoarder, and she was determined she had to feed the world. That was going to be her responsibility. So that became an issue. So all of these are all that are related. This trauma was all related to that time period, and of course it affected me as a child growing up. These are all things that I had to fight so that they didn't become part of my personality.
But then it does.
But then it does.
Yeah,
to a certain point.
There's little parts that are such a part of our view of normality that we don't understand that it's not normality, neither is it in our best interest. So how did you change that?
With the hoarding, I really had to work at that. And that was more of a talking to myself. No, I don't need a dozen cans of corn. I only need 1. And when I had a garden, during my first marriage, I had a garden, and I would can like crazy, because that's what my mother always did. She canned everything, canned and froze everything. So we had lots of freezers. My second husband came from an English family, urban area. No, you go to the store and buy food. You don't need a garden. So I really had to fight to try to get every tomato plant I could possibly get. And even then, by that point in time, I had no more interest in hoarding a lot of food. So my pantry has certainly become smaller over the years, but I hoard in other ways. I collect books, a lot of books, and it was really, really hard. Every time I move, I've got to get rid of a few more 100 books and get rid of them. So I hoard in different ways, and I'm very conscious about that, because I don't want to be my mother. Okay. I don't want to be like that. And the stories that she told me about going back to the whole identity and trying to find her voice, she told me those things in private. I can talk about them now. She's passed on. And my brothers probably aren't even aware of half the stuff that I know about what went on. But I was very conscious that she didn't have a voice, and she was frustrated that she didn't have a voice. And so she tried to make up for it in different ways. With my dad and his trauma, I was the only daughter, and I had 3 brothers, and growing up in that culture, I had to stay in the background, and yet I always felt alone. So the only way I could bond with my dad was over books, because we both enjoyed reading, and he enjoyed writing, and he always talked about wanting to write a book one day. And so that was where I have found my connection with him long after he's passed, is in that task of doing that.
So let's talk about generational shame, because that's something that most of us are carrying some sort of shame with us. That if you come from a place where you didn't have enough food. My mother was born in 1953, which was a big drought, and a very similar kind of thing. She was a hoarder too, and they went through a whole period, big depression, big drought, where money was a very big issue. And then there's shame and there's fear. There's money fears and there's shame. And it affects us if we're not aware of it. And we only become aware of it so much later in life. So if we're not aware of it, it can really have a big influence on our life. Like, you were lucky that you got a husband who was like, what is this hoarding thing,
Yeah.
But could put some perspective on it. If you were with another Mennonite, it would be like, yes, woman, go can a few more things. No? That's what we do.
Yeah.
But just to get that perspective from the outside, and to actually start to challenge our own thought systems, our own belief systems. And we don't often don't even have that luxury that we get the input from outside to move on from shame that we are carrying. Like I was carrying the shame of my father's alcoholism, and I was carrying the shame of my parents' divorce, which is, of course, foreign to people nowadays to think that a 7-8-year-old could want to hide because her mother is divorced, her parents are divorced. And it's a very common thing. It's so common nowadays. But whenever there is anything in your family that feels to you, no matter how ridiculous it is, that it is shame-inducing, you have to confront it somewhere along the line. Did you have a similar thing that you had to go through?
There was a lot of shame, and I'm trying to find the words to say this. I was sexually assaulted and sexually molested as a child, and that was fairly common. That happened, and
what do you mean fairly common?
In my generation, sexual abuse was fairly common, and the laws again were not there to protect children in those days. So those of us who were being molested had nowhere to go. And I remember trying to tell my mother about what was going on, and she just waved it off. I'm sure she didn't understand at that point in time. And so I was taught, well, that was like, put up with it. You know, after all, men are right and women are wrong, and then that came back again to that.
Yeah. So you're talking about the era before there was a lot of publicity, and I mean, we really have to thank Oprah for this. Oprah opened the doors for people to understand it's not their shame, and she talked about it so openly that it opened the doors for thousands and thousands of women and men to actually start talking about it and not to feel it as their own shame.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then yes, and then there was the religious pressure of always trying to appear as a perfect family. Mm. You know, when there was things going on and not being permitted to actually be who I am, or say my piece, or speak out, or talk about any hypocrisy that I might be seeing. I wasn't allowed to speak about those things. And so, yes, you feel guilty, you feel shameful. The Mennonite people as a whole, because of after what came out of Russia, I think carried a lot of shame, because there was shame just for the fact that they were German. Mm-hmm. Okay, in Russia, and I grew up. I mean, there was racism, if you want to call it that. It's bigotry. Anyway, I was called Kraus the Mouse, and I was called a Kraut, and I was called a Nazi because of German ethnicity. So there was a lot of put downs that I had to go through, and when there was an element, the business community of the Mennonites were actually, in a way, very full of thought themselves better than the locals. And so there was a tendency to abuse labor, and a tendency to sort of, they kept themselves segregated from the other population because they thought they were special in their own class. So there was a lot of that kind of attitude that went on. And I think when they were expelled from Russia, and the cultural genocide that happened, because all those graves were erased from the earth. The tombstones, the markers were erased from the earth. Stalin made sure there was no evidence of us anymore, and that was there. So there was a definite shame in being who we were, and yet at the same time we reached into our faith to redeem us, because we knew God loved us anyway, and we knew that our faith was important, and we had to survive somehow. So there was hope, right? But still, there was shame from all of these different elements. And they certainly showed up, a lot of it showed up in mental illness in our families.
Yeah, and I think they show up a lot in how we limit ourselves. So it shows up in our limiting beliefs. And until we actually start challenging our belief systems, until we start examining where are all our thoughts and our patterns coming from, and like really our limiting beliefs. If we start listing our limiting beliefs and we trace the history of it and we start bringing logic into it, like in your case, if you start challenging, should I feel ashamed for something that happened in Russia so many years ago? Should I logically be? Is it time that I face this and that I leave behind the shame, the generational shame? I think every one of us need to do that. Okay, so Miranda, let's look at our comments here. We've got a few more new comments here. Okay, maybe I've got my long glasses off. Can't see with this. Maybe with this one I can. Okay. Hi, Selena. Nice to see you again. Okay, let's see. Oh, yeah. I had no choice, he said. So, all right, let's see the next one. Okay, there's no other one. Selena, there's no sequel to this. We want a sequel. So,
Yes.
Did you marry the guy that your husband said, or that your father said you must marry, and you were happy? We need the sequel. We need.
Yeah.
Please give us the sequel.
She says she wrote her autobiography, so maybe we have to pick up her autobiography.
Yeah, she's written a book, and I think we've put it in the previous chat's link. So yeah, it sounds like it's going to be a really good book.
Yeah,
okay,
but Louise, I was just thinking that the issue with mental illness, I think even when a parent has any form of mental illness, whether it's an addiction or another kind of mental illness, the child just naturally feels ashamed, and they don't know why they feel ashamed, but they do. And so it's almost like I almost grew up feeling ashamed. And I guess as a teenager, I was ashamed of being from that culture. And I wanted to be different. I wanted to be like everybody else. And I think that's taken most of my life, because I finally got to the point and said, wait a minute. And I think it was my trip to the Ukraine in 2014 that did it, because I went there and I was looking for my great-grandparents' grave sites, and took a private guide to look over a particular area. And there was none. And the guide said, there's nothing there but fields. But that village was burnt down. Those grave sites were destroyed. There's nothing there. And it was like they didn't exist. There was a part of me that didn't exist. And that sat with me for a few years. And I always knew that I wanted to write the story about what happened to them, but I didn't have I had to step out of that shame-based mindset and saying, wait a minute, there's a serious story here. There's a story of struggle. It's a bold story. And it ends up well because, they started over in Canada. So the ending is good, but I need to step out of this because this is a part of history very few people know about. And it needs stories that need to be told. And so that was part of my stepping out of my shame, was to sit down and start writing this.
Yeah, I understand this. You know what? There's a parallel here because Afrikaners are being blamed for a whole lot of stuff, and the history is not put into perspective. And if I tell people about my great grandfather who was a prisoner on Saint Helena and his farm was burned, and my entire family was the woman and the children were put into concentration camps, and they lost absolutely everything they had, and they had to start from scratch again. And just because another nation wanted the diamonds, it was like, we want the diamonds, we want the gold, we are coming. And bugger you, if you fight against us, we're just going to put you all into concentration camps and ship your men off to St. Helena. And that's also intergenerational trauma that you carry. But I'm very proud of my people. I'm very proud because of the way, I'm very proud of my own grandparents because of the way that they started again and again, and they never gave up. And they were decent people, and they were very caring, always. Afrikaners are decent people. They are model people, and they care for the people who work with them, work for them. And there are people like in everybody, all races and all cultures. There are people who are not good people, and it's just a human thing. But it is quite hard to be part of a culture that's being blamed for everything. It's just the scapegoat, and the politicians will use it. When you know that your people are good people, and they are moral people, and they are hardworking, and they've got strong religious beliefs and strong loyalties, and that the picture that is being painted is not the truth. So I understand what you're saying. I really do understand what you're saying about, and I think also in this country we've gone for a long time. We have just kept our mouths shut, and we have not stood tall and proud because it wasn't politically correct.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the sort of thing. If people keep on putting shame on you for long enough, you tend to stand back a bit, and you don't stand tall. And nobody should have to go through it, and especially not because whoever it is, whether it's Stalin or Lenin or whichever politician it is, whether it is a current politician, it is just not right to stand on a people as a whole.
That's right.
In order to promote yourself and your own views. Okay, so we're going to have to finish now. So I'm going to just show your cover once more there for people. But you're going to put it into, okay, there it is. There's the sequel. My autobiography tells it all. I must get this book. I absolutely must let it there. I love autobiographies. It's and especially there's some history with it.
Yes,
so
for sure.
Yeah, I'm looking and interesting cultures that comes with it. So I am going to. Okay, so you will go into the chat afterwards. You put a link to your book, right? And it's coming out next week or a week after.
It is okay. So the hard copy is out now, and the paperback will be officially launched September the 7th.
Okay,
so we've got a few more weeks yet.
Yeah, so I want to see who else is curious about it. I'm really curious about it. I can't wait. I'm looking forward to this book. I'm going to have to go on holiday so I can read it. Is anybody else who likes things? That's a good idea. Give me a like there. Give us a heart there in the chat. I think I've got a few people rooting for me going on holiday too, and to have a good book. Okay. All right. So everybody who's been here for the chat, thank you all for watching this. And Miranda, I'm so glad we managed to finally have this conversation, because we were writing our books at the very first time. So we've been sisters in editing and creating the covers over and over and over until it's just right. So we've been through a journey together.
We sure have.
Thank you for showing up and telling us your story. It's so interesting to put our lives in perspective according to history. So thank you for that, and thank you for sharing, and thank you for being honest and transparent. And everybody who's watching, will go back in and we'll comment. And if any of you are inspired to write something, then we know the right people, go for it. And also, if you are inspired to tell your story, please do, because this is what frees you. The more you tell your story, the less you are burdened by the shame, which you're not even supposed to be carrying. So Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Miranda. Much love to everyone. Okay, this is the time when we don't go away until I've played my video. You all know the story. I need to find my video. And see you next time.
Bye-bye. Thank you.